Welcome, I'm Rami Khouri from the Media Studies program at AUB. Welcome to another session of the AUB Beirut COVID-19 briefing, where every week we have a professor from AUB talking about a different dimension of the situation of the pandemic and the related dimensions of it. We have in New York, Alison Freeland, who will be taking questions from the audience. Is Alison there?
Hi, thank you, Rami, and thank you so much for letting us be in on this with Dr. Saliba. And I would just like to remind people who are on the Facebook chat that if you have questions or comments, you can type it into the chat and we will relay them. And again, we're excited to get maybe a more long view of this pandemic than just the immediate.
Thank you. Well, we're really honored to have as our guest today Professor George Saliba, who is, I only recently got to know him, and he's a gem of a person and the gem of a center and the gem of a building, and I'll explain that in a minute. He's the director and professor of the Farouk Jabr Center for Arabic and Islamic Science and Philosophy at AUB. He's also a professor emeritus at Columbia University in Arabic and Islamic Science. And his center is inside the old Lee Observatory building, which was one of the first buildings built at AUB in the 19th century, and appropriately enough for astronomy, and one of his specialties is Arabic and Islamic astronomical sciences. And the subject we want to talk about today, first of all, welcome, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Rami.
The topic we want to talk about really is what can we learn from Arabic and Islamic science and philosophy going back 1400 or even more years, however back far we want to go. What can we learn about how we deal with the pandemic today? And the question to begin with I'd ask is, you know, you have a pandemic of a virus today, then you have contagions, you have other forms of mass suffering and danger and fear among the population. So what can we learn from the work you do in your wonderful center?
The short answer is the following. Is that looking historically at a long period of about 1,400 years or so gives us the advantage of the global picture, and hence we do not get too focused onto the one issue, and then we forget the whole forest. We look at the tree and not the forest. Islamic civilization dealt with many pandemics, but and almost when you look at the history of pandemics, they are universal. They keep coming over and over again. The causes for them vary, and hence every civilization, no matter where, could not hide from them. So they had to face it early on, and they had to face it on all levels. The second thing that we learn from it, not only we get the experience of how do we classify pandemics, how do we look at them, the other one is that how people dealt with them on the moral level, on the religious level, on the legal level, and also on the medical level. Specifically in this issue, we are dealing with medical treatises with diseases that very few people understood, and up till now, unfortunately, they still don't understand.
Well, this is the COVID-19 is a new virus. We're learning about it.
Yeah, but this was the case with every virus that came around, or with every condition that came around. Conditions always varied. But one thing we learned also, when you review a whole series of pandemics that have gone through history, they were almost always associated with famines. And hence almost always associated with the environment around us, and hence, for example, our global warming is not a joke. It's going to cause all sorts of pandemics in the future, and I think this may be similar to this or even worse.
Wow.
Also droughts, for example, the biblical dimensions. If you remember the plagues of the Bible, the 7, 8 plagues, they were not a joke either, meaning these are things that kept repeating. And hence Islamic civilization inherited this. But immediately from the very beginning, they began to theorize it. For example, they wanted to know what is really contagion. What are the factors that make it transferable from one person to the other, or is it really transferable? Or is it something that individual get bad luck from God, and then it afflicts them and so on. The earliest treatise that I know of was written by a man called Qusta ibn Luqa. He was from here, from Baalbek,
Wow.
from Lebanon, and he worked in Baghdad about the 9th century, and he literally addressed the treatise specifically on the nature of the contagion. Why does it become contagious, and what is contagious about it? So he went into the philosophical realm of trying to understand what contagion means. And then he noticed that not all contagion is really bad contagion. He says, for example, you go into a room and you see everybody laughing in the room, you begin to laugh too, meaning you get this contagious laugh passes on to you. He also says, which is something that everybody experiences, if you are in a room and somebody yawns, automatically you also yawn.
Yes.
Somehow he calls these are not medical contagions, they are spiritual. He says, meaning contagions of civil behavior, of our humanity. But then he goes to the second level and says there are medical contagions, and that he goes all the way back to classical Greek from the days of Hippocrates, who actually wrote the very famous treatise on airs, waters, and places. So he says for our health, we really need to worry about these. We need to worry about the air we breathe, we need to worry about the water we drink, and also the seasonal changes and the places where we are in the cosmic realm.
Wow.
It gives us some insights of how our health is going to react to all of these things. This legacy of the Hippocrates was picked on, of course, by Galen by the 1st century AD, who wrote a long treatise on Hippocrates, and both of them pushed the theory, which continued to be up till today. I think it's still useful to think about it, that it is actually the immediate cause that actually causes the bodies to react is what they called at the time is the miasma, meaning it is the air, the surrounding environment around us. If the air is not healthy, give you an example. If you are walking by the Corniche here in Beirut during the summer months and the cars are running just like everything else, the pollution will get you sick whether you like it or not.
Yes.
Meaning the pollution is a very serious thing, but already Hippocrates was trying to tell us that the air that we breathe is a contributing factor, and hence he says on the medical level we should only worry about these 3 factors: the air we breathe, the water we drink, and react to the environment. For example, again, you are not supposed to drink water that is polluted. You're not going, or you should not be eating fruits out of season.
Right.
If you wait for them in season, you are in harmony with the seasons.
Right.
You get all sorts of benefits from this. So this treatise exists, but it was followed by several treatises on the subject. Every physician had to theorize about it, and then we have a long legacy of these things. But again, the other lesson that I think I want us to learn from it is that it was not restricted only to the physicians. The whole society was engaged in this activity. The legal scholars had to worry about it. The religious scholars had to worry about it. The reactions that they implied by it directed our treatment of how do we treat the sick, and also where do we create the institutions that actually take care of the sick, and all of that. All of those issues are interconnected, and hence in our day, modern civilization where we separate things and pigeonhole them is not a healthy environment to actually take care of pandemics like this. Everybody has to contribute, and from their own angle, so we will all deal with it in a miasmic way, so to speak.
Right, in a holistic way. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's very important, and this is how it seems to have worked.
So you've given me enough information to ask you enough questions for a whole course, but we don't have time for a whole course. I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
You've mentioned the different roles and responsibilities in society. I want to ask you about religious authority, religious interpretation, religious requirements for Muslims and other religions. And I want to ask you about political authority, political governance, political responsibility and accountability, because what we see today with this pandemic is governments, central governments taking the lead, but everybody's got to be involved, including every household has to be involved. So when you look at religion, governance, political authority, and civic society, personal liberties, the mixture of those in Arab-Islamic history, how do you, when you look back, can you differentiate between those, and particularly the role of religion?
Yeah, well, of course, luckily we have leads onto these things. And we live also and we inherited an Islamic culture that has almost recorded everything we have, whether it is in the Quranic text or it is in the statements of the Prophet, and they have all faced similar situations, and hence we have guidelines as to go from them. For example, it's not accidental that ancient classical poetry in pre-Islamic times spoke directly about contagion. They knew that if you bring a camel that has scabies on it and you mix it with the other herd, it's going to infect the herd. The famous poet Taraf ibn al-Abd says, I will do it first in Arabic and then I translate it for you. He says, وَقَدْ تَحَامَتْنِي الْقَبِيلَةُ كُلُّهَا كَأُفْرِدْتُ كَإِفْرَادَ الْبَعِيرِ الْمُعَبَّدِ. Meaning my whole tribe, because of his excessive behavior with indulgence and all of that, excluded him and treated him as if he was a camel that had the disease, and hence he had to be treated by ta'bid. Mu'abbad is a kind of qutran, a kind of paste used out of petrol products, and then they covered the camels with this in order to, and secluded them. So already in pre-Islamic times they dealt with contagion, they worried about it, and of course the camel and the herd is their property, so they had to worry about these things. Now, also when it comes to the Prophet himself, he had left us a whole lot of guidance on these issues. There are several statements that are misinterpreted and attributed to the Prophet. Of course, it comes from a specific religious angle. People who say, no matter what happened to me, it is the will of God. Meaning, whether I die tomorrow, or I laugh, or I get married, whatever, it's the will of God, and hence I don't need to worry about it. When the same issue was also discussed at the time of the Prophet, and what causes this waba, which they mean plagues and the likes, what are the causes of them? The pre-Islamic tribes used to attribute them to the intervention of jinnis and devils and the likes.
Spirits and things like that.
Well, actually the terms that they use, it says, these are like the picky, what do you call it? Like actually stinking devils that are causing this. Okay. The Prophet responded by this in his own way to say there is no such thing. Also, it came together with three other things that we should not listen to them because these are fictitious kind of irreligious statements that these they cause. Also, the other form is that if you see a bird, for example, flying and you say this is a bad omen or a good omen, it says no, neither that nor the devil's interventions nor of these things. Hence, you should not think about it as a contagion caused by the devils. Hence, also, the second sentence, or second a couple guidelines that come from the Prophet says, if you happen to be in a city that has a plague in it and a generalized disease, first thing you do, don't leave that city because then you will spread the contagion. But then also, if you are traveling to a place that you hear there is a plague in that place, change your mind. And this indeed happened to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, on his way to Damascus. Here he's halfway from Medina, and he heard that there was a plague inflicting Damascus. So he consulted first with the Muhajirin, then with the Ansar, then with the chiefs of Quraysh, and then he decided to go back to Medina and not continue his path to Damascus to avoid a confrontation with the plague and this. So these guidelines, meaning it's almost like exercise self-containment, it's exercise seclusion. What we are calling it, and I jokingly call it, exercise house arrest.
Yes.
If you are in a position where you are in a city where you really are suffering, or the city is suffering from a plague, confine yourself and don't spread it.
So the historical context of pandemics and plagues and famines and mass trauma has been addressed obviously by, like I said, religious authorities from the highest level on down, to municipal authorities, to political authorities, to different kinds of groups. If you look at the situation today in the Arab and Islamic world, which is very diverse and has many different kinds of systems, can we learn from history, of Arab-Islamic history, about who has the primary responsibility to reduce the suffering and try to bring back a normal life?
The strongest message that I get from the two plagues or pandemics that I have looked at, the one that took place about the year 1200, and particularly in Cairo, and it came as a result of 2 to 3 consecutive years of drought that happened in Central Africa, and hence the Nile level dropped down. That is about the year 1194 or so, and hence once the level of the Nile dropped down, the irrigation got disrupted, people got scared. Out of fear, they began to run away from Cairo, and as a result, they got a drop in the products, hence the economic crisis that comes, and hence the famine now becomes a contributor to the plague, and the plague itself now lives on the economic disaster, which is not too different from what's happening in Lebanon right now.
Exactly.
Because of the corona now, we are experiencing an aggravated economic situation, which is making life more difficult for everybody. But then the report of the physician who came from Baghdad to visit Cairo about the year 1200, that was also the time when the famous Maimonides also came from Spain to Cairo about the year 1200, both of them trying to become physicians under Salah ad-Din, the famous Salah ad-Din who had recently conquered Cairo. Both of them report to us cases of starvation to such a degree, it was so severe that even people were eating their own children.
Wow.
Or any defenseless human being would be eating. And this gets reported by several reports. And but now it depends on what do you do with this information.
Yes.
The first respondent, now to go to your question, who takes care of people and protects them from being eaten, from children and the likes? Usually the local authorities. They go to the wali, meaning the central caliphate at the time was either in Baghdad or in Cairo. The central government was too far removed and hence did not know the day-to-day suffering of the persons, and hence the local wali actually arrested a woman because she was accused of eating her own child.
Wow.
And it was the wali, it is his responsibility. The shurta, I mean these terms, these institutions of the police under the governance of the wali took care of the solution, and they took it much more efficiently than waiting for the news to go to Cairo and the response to come from the caliph, all of that. So the local officers and the local authorities are usually, and if we learn nothing from this history except that these are the ones who know the day-to-day situation and they know how to treat it very efficiently, and those we should have them prepared to take these actions. Of course, this downside of all of this, if these local authorities do not have the infrastructure, as in the case that we had it at the time also, that the local wali of Egypt does not have all of the support of the police to be able to monitor everybody. That's where it aggravates the situation even more. And this is not too different from what we have right now. We had witnessed in Italy first the collapse of the medical system. We have witnessed it in the United States, and I think it's still going on because of the lack of preparedness. Hence, if we learn nothing from this, is that the local authorities should be well supported and should be also well trained and well prepared to deal with contingencies of this nature. No pun intended on contagion.
Yes. Well, this raises related questions about authority and legitimacy and accountability, but we have some comments, questions from New York. Allison?
Yes, Professor Saliba, we have people following us from Vancouver and Cyprus, Atlanta, Dubai, Montreal, Italy, Indianapolis, Lebanon, and we have peace and love from Los Angeles, which is good to hear. And one of the questions we have is there any way when you're looking at the historical records that you can see the average duration of one of these pandemics or one of these contagions?
Bad news. I should tell you that of all the records that I know, the most aggravated situations is the 1200 pandemic that hit Cairo. And then, of course, the Black Death that everybody knows about it, and it was universal much more than the 1200 case of Cairo. All of them, as I said, the economic aggravating situations and the failure of agriculture, the failure of the products and all of that began about a year to 2 years before the actual onset of the pandemic. And then it goes on for a couple of years. Let's not forget, by the way, that the Black Death went on for about 4 years and made its rounds all the way from Central Asia through Europe and then back to the Middle East. And it goes on from 1346 or so all the way to 1352, 53. So 4 or 5 years is not an easy thing to deal with.
Right.
It's not like something you can call your bank tomorrow and say, get me the money now.
Yes.
All of this stuff takes time. The case of Cairo, the pandemic of 1200, luckily was in a sense contained because it was aggravated by the failure of the rise of the Nile, and hence the crops of Egypt were failed. People at the beginning, of course, once they realized that the failure is coming, they began to run to what is called in the sources Bilad Sham. They go to what is Palestine, Syria, and all of those areas. But the pandemic itself, the disease that resulted from the drought and the famines, did not spread to these other areas. So it is not a virus that actually could be carried by, in the same way the Black Death was carried. So luckily, when it remains local, it tends to survive less. And then, of course, hopefully, God will send rain. And that's what happened in the case of the Nile.
Inshallah.
If the water level goes up, the floods come in, and then the irrigation works, and then society begins to pick up very quickly.
So one of the lessons is that these pandemics and contagions are a combination of environmental issues, man-made issues, viruses and things that we can't control, and how we respond to them all wrapped up together.
From my perspective, the virus effect is very minimal. What happened is the maladministration. Is also what happened is that the man-made and unpreparedness, the failure of the infrastructure, those aggravated the situation much more. Let me add one more thing,
Yes.
which also the medieval times are in much beneficial situation than we are. Because of the 19th century onwards, we have become not only modernized, and recently over the last 50 years, we became globalized.
Yes.
To that effect, the globalization, as a matter of fact, is not a service to humanity, because now you get an infection of a disease, of a virus, somewhere in mid-China, in two days it is in Europe. So the speed with which the disease, especially viral diseases, the speed with which they spread is a result of our modernization and of our mobility and all of that. Hence, the medieval times, when I compare it, and I find that Cairo's pandemic did not did not spread to Syria. It stayed in Cairo, and within a couple of years, once the Nile started flooding again, people got back to normal life. So it's not always good to be modernized. It's not always good to be globalized either. So there is a downside to globalization. There is downside also to modernity.
Yes. We have another question, I think, from New York.
Yes, I'd like to try to get in two questions quickly. Someone is asking if you see any indication that there was a sense of immunity or understanding immunity in the historical records. And then the second question is there any particular administrative move that happened that seemed to be very effective? So two different questions, immunity and also effective administration.
Yeah. And unfortunately, again, from all the pandemics that I looked at, they all came with new viruses, and there was no immunity ready for them. But quickly, especially the localized ones, as in the case of Cairo, seems people to have got sort of vaccinated themselves, so to speak, and they got over it. But in terms of medications or the like, that didn't exist in the historical times. So we are not talking of that. But also to go back on the administrative and intervention level, I keep insisting that the local authorities should be given enough authority and enough funding and the training to respond as quickly as they can, because they know the situation intimately well. That is usually the savior of things, rather than waiting for some bureaucrat in Washington to tell what the Australians should be doing or what the New Zealanders should be doing. In that sense, get the local government to work about it. The local wali knew better, and immediately, if he felt that cannibalism was spreading in Cairo, he immediately executed the people who were committing that crime. And that stopped everybody. As a result, cannibalism was nipped in the bud.
Yes. So that raises the question of authority and citizens responding to authority. And this is interesting because the very rich Arab and Islamic history is a context that you've studied well and we know a lot about now. And you look at the Arab and Islamic world today, there are quarters of great efficiency and righteousness and good governance. And then there are places of mass catastrophe in governance, corruption, waste, mismanagement, lack of authority, citizens doing whatever they want. So how do you relate the past to the present in terms when it comes to these issues of, well, okay, what can we learn from the past to help us deal with the issue today? You mentioned the local governance, which I think is probably pretty critical.
One thing also we should have learned all the way through is individual responsibility. Every single Muslim did not have, and up till this very day, no Muslim had to go through a bishop, through a pope, or through a church to be able to intercede with God. We are all individually responsible right in front of God.
Yes.
That individual responsibility, if it remained to be nourished, and if political systems of today do not take over that role. As a matter of fact, it is the corruption of the invasion of the political systems onto the moral and the religious systems that actually took over, that corrupts the system and makes it much, much worse. I'll give you one example from history, where a legal judge, who is the founder of the famous juridical school of Abu Hanifa, he was asked by the Caliph al-Mansur to sit as a judge, meaning once you are appointed as a judge, you become a subject of the political authority.
The Caliph.
He refused.
Yeah.
Yes, the political authority is invested in the Caliph at
Yes.
this time because there is no state to speak. He refused to take the job because he says, I have to keep the moral level so that I can judge you when you are actually in error.
Yes.
And of course, he got lashed for a whole month. Every day he woke up, he got 10 lashes, 20 lashes, and they kept increasing for him to change his mind. And Abu Hanifa refused to change his mind. Meaning that this independence of the judiciary this independence of the personal responsibility that he took upon himself, that he has to judge the political authority, is non-existent nowadays.
Right.
See, what happened is that we inherited from the 19th century onwards, from the age of colonialism, mock-up situations all over the Islamic world, but I should say also all over the non-European world that was colonized by the Europeans. Right. They all inherited the very same defects of the colonizing movement, and as a result, they are still struggling to find themselves, to find what system of government do they want. Look at us in Lebanon. Now they are discussing whether we should have that kind of Lebanon or this kind of Lebanon. Should we enshrine once more the divisions by sectarian divisions in a country that's basically even much less than one neighborhood in Manhattan?
Right.
But if you do this kind of thing, it means you are malmanaging the whole situation, and unfortunately for us.
Well, it's no accident that the people who are out demonstrating, holding uprisings and protests and revolutions across many Arab countries, one of their central demands is an independent judiciary.
I'm all in support of that, and I hope they succeed in doing that, but it is easier to demand than to actually bring to the execution, the level of actually creating the Abu Hanifas that we need.
Right.
We need the kind of judiciary that is proud, that is confident of their jurisdiction, and who feel that they are superior to the political authority, and they should dictate what their conscience actually tells them.
Right.
That unfortunately takes a lot of time to build it, and hopefully I think I see good signs here in Lebanon that at least they are beginning to build a good independent judiciary that I hope one day will arrest one politician. That if they do.
Well, they've started to arrest a few people, money changers, and one or two other things.
That's nibbling at the edges.
Let's see what happens. Yeah. We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to ask you a couple other questions. There are institutions in Arab and Islamic history, the Waqf, the hospital, the public library, the madrasa. What do these institutions from our traditions tell us about our situation today that might help us cope with it?
Here again, the role of charity, most important roles. These waqfs are actually charity institutions, and they were directed to the will of the beneficiary, meaning the one who actually donates the waqf decides how the waqf ought to be spent, how to be to administer the waqf. And also there was dispute within the judicial system of the four famous juridical schools of Islam as to whether the one who donates the money for charity should in some form derive benefit from it. That's where corruption begins with.
Yes.
And only one school, and that is the school, the Maliki school that is famous in North Africa and in Spain, refused to allow a fund donor, a foundation donor, to derive any particular benefits from it.
Wow.
And that was disputed by the other three schools because they said it cuts on the incentive. And hence, we need to allow the debate is enormous, but these are the institutions that actually established the madrasas, established the hospitals, established the home for the aged, the orphanages, all of them. They were all a charity institution. They didn't depend on the government to do it.
So as we enter a period now across most of the Arab world, with a few oil-rich countries, where poverty, marginalization, vulnerability, and inequality are rising very quickly, and destitution, pauperization for a lot of people, what can we learn from our history in terms of the most effective, legitimate way to address the needs of huge numbers of people who are in need? The latest figures I've been following from the United Nations and others showing that poverty and vulnerability in the Arab world now affect 70%, 70%. So a majority, the Arab nation is a nation of paupers.
That's not
this
surprising.
is a huge challenge.
That's not surprising because, again, unfortunately, what we inherited from the colonial period is this free-range capitalism, everyone for his profits. And hence, we reduce, and actually they stole, I think, most of those politicians who were nurtured and were actually set up by the colonial powers. I think they ended up squandering the money that was endowed originally for charitable uses so that institutions can survive and all of that. Unfortunately, those institutions need to be replenished. Governments should keep their fingers out of them. They should allow these things to take their normal course and to address the needs of the much larger masses for whom they were benefiting. The more we get the politicians to interfere with this kind of normal cycle of charity giving, the more the aggravation will become, because by nature, unfortunately, I have very little faith in politicians keeping their hands in their pockets.
Well, there are also traditions that you've mentioned to me in Arab-Islamic history about how to deal with price gouging and monopolies, things of people who take advantage of the population, which is very common.
Not only that, it became a dictum to say whoever monopolizes becomes automatically an unbeliever. By the term unbeliever, man ihtakara kafara.
Wow.
Literally, now when you classify somebody as a kafir, it means any Muslim can take it upon himself to actually, or herself for this matter, to actually execute this person because he is actually monopolizing and depriving the rest of the society from the benefits that they should have. So that also the other dictum that came directly from the religious history is that injustice, it is the duty of every individual to actually fight injustice.
Right.
And hence, Nasrat al-Mazloom is the expression used in the Arabic text, is to speak of it is your individual duty. There we go back to the individual relationship. No intermediary, no bishop, no church, no organization is going to urge you to do what you feel morally you should do. And hence, if you see the destitute in the street, if you see the body who is being treated unjustly, it's your duty to actually do something about it.
We have only a few minutes. New York, last question.
Yes, we want to thank you for the historical perspective, and also in starting to look at the history of the pandemics. We are wondering if what it has sparked in you, in your own curiosity, that you're going to look at next.
Oh, oh, tons of things. In other words, I discovered by preparing for this thing, I began to look at sources I never thought that they existed. But it is such a rich field now to actually look, but again, the gem of it all, it is the interconnectedness of every aspect of life. That's what I'm learning, that the legal people are not separated from the politicians, they are not separated from the physicians, they are not separated from the scientists. All of them are interconnected, and they deeply realize this interconnectedness. And if I look at it as a student of history, and I see that this interconnectedness being efficiently exhibited over this period, I take great pleasure in exploring it in every level I can go.
And you're at an amazing institution at AUB where you have philosophy, sociology, medicine, agriculture, water. You have specialists in all fields of life, and you run a center for science and philosophy. So do we need to bring together these disciplines that have been separated in modern times?
This was my very aim, is to specifically bring back both philosophy and science to their original role, where actually philosophy, even from ancient Greek times, nurtured the sciences, and actually the sciences were always thought of, even by Aristotle, to be part of the philosophical structure. If we don't have a unified vision of our cosmos, of our relationship into the whole world that we live in, we are going to be petty little pickers, and we are not going to produce anything at all. And literally, we will begin to see many trees, but we will lose the forest.
On that cosmic note, Dr. George Saliba, thank you very much for being with us. And we will look forward to what comes out of your center and other students and professors who will work with you at AUB.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you very much. And thank you in New York, if you can still hear us. And good luck to you.
Thank you. And just a note to our viewers, next week we have another exciting episode where we're going to talk to a philosopher about the philosophical and ethical dilemmas of people today in the age of the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you choose to go to work, or do you risk your life, or do you choose to stay home and save your health and your family's health? Do you listen to your government? Do you disregard what your government says? Do you travel at will? Do you wear a mask? Personal liberty, collective well-being. These are ethical, moral, philosophical questions, and we'll have Professor Bashar Haidar from the philosophy department with us next week to help us work through these issues. Thanks for everybody for being with us. Thank you in New York, Allison. Thanks for the crew, and we'll hope to have you with us again next week.